Welcome to Lenten Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, Chance and Bev, thank you for being on with me today. Today, we're again looking at one of those last 7 things Jesus said from the cross. And those are all, of course, recorded across all of the Gospels. This is one of the last things Jesus says in Luke's gospel, and it's, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And the scene that unfolds is basically this. The temple leadership, they've brought Jesus to the Roman governor Pilate. They've accused Jesus of inciting a rebellion, but Pilate finds no fault with Jesus. And at first he tries to deflect responsibility, and he sends Jesus off to King Herod, under whose jurisdiction Jesus technically falls as a Galilean. But Herod just ridicules and mocks Jesus, and then he sends him back to Pilate. And he's planning to just torture him a bit to appease those who brought Jesus to him and then release Jesus. But the crowd has been incited, and they're shouting for Pilate to crucify him anyway. They want Pilate to release this violent insurrectionist, Barabbas, instead. And Pilate, he begs the crowd to give him some sort of justification. Tell him what crime Jesus has committed. Mm-hmm. But the crowd stays hauntingly silent. And Pilate loses his backbone. He caves, and Jesus is led away to be crucified. And there are 2 others who are also led out to be crucified at the same time as Jesus. And when they reach Golgotha, the place of the skull that's on the outskirts of Jerusalem, they crucify him along with these criminals. And perhaps to our stunned amazement, as we read the Gospels, one of these criminals also starts to mock Jesus, telling him that if he's the Messiah, save yourself and us. But then the other one interrupts this guy and rebukes him and says, "Don't you fear God, since you're under the same sentence?" And he says, "We are punished justly for getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he begs Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Mm-hmm. And Jesus answers, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So let's start with who these 2 men are. We aren't given too much other than this label, criminal. And one of the criminals seems to believe that they are being justly punished for their deeds. But we do know that they are being crucified, and that gives us a little clue about them. Tell me what we know about crucifixion. What kind of criminal was crucifixion reserved for?
First of all, it would have been the poor people, the non-citizens of Rome, and slaves, former slaves, thieves, murderers, those who were trying to rebel against the Romans. And I would suspect probably some irritating people that they just wanted to get rid of.
Right. So not Roman citizens. These would have been occupied peoples who didn't enjoy full citizenship. Roman citizens wouldn't have been crucified. Were just any kind of common criminal or thief crucified on crosses?
No, from what I've been reading, it's people like one author said there was reserved for enemies of the state, insurrectionists, like Bev said, slaves that maybe have even escaped and committed crimes of some sort. And a big reason for crucifixion was humiliation, more than it was really the pain. It was just the humiliation of being crucified. But I think it was, to Bev's point, I think it was a lot of times reserved for people that they wanted to make an example out of, to let everybody else know, don't do what this person did or you will end up in the same condition that they are. It was a power thing.
Yes.
So this was probably anyone who did anything that undermined the empire that would be subject to crucifixion. Now, tell me about the scene in Jerusalem. We're so used to all those Good Friday Calvary images with the 3 crosses on the hill. Was there just one hill? Were there just 3 crosses? What do you know about it?
I know that there were a lot of people being crucified, not just 3, because they left the bodies there to rot or until the animals ate them. And a lot of places had the vertical post permanent, and then they would attach the cross. And so you would probably have a hill. And I'm sure there were, wherever there were prominent places where they would see, people would see them, they would put these crosses up and then hang bodies and leave them hanging there.
Yeah, I think Sue Sherwood in one of our Lenten conversations mentioned that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of crosses on the roads into Jerusalem, so that you'd pass lots of crucified bodies as you were traveling down the roads near Jerusalem. So it wasn't just these 3 crosses on this one hill.
Now, the Romans certainly didn't invent crucifixion, but they really liked it. So I'm pretty sure there were a lot, but I think suffice it to say that there were a lot more than just 3. Maybe in that one spot there were just 3 at that time, but there were more, I think.
And what, we kind of mentioned it already, but what sort of message would these bodies up on these crosses communicate to those who walked by and saw them?
Don't do what they did.
And fear Rome. They are powerful.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really was about fear, wasn't it? Making people fearful of crossing the empire, of resisting. Now, we don't use crosses, but it seems to me that we have our equivalent of crucifixion. I'd like to read just a little bit from James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Cone writes, while white mob violence against African Americans was an obsession in the South, it was not limited to that region. White supremacy was and is an American reality. Whites lynched blacks in nearly every state. Wherever blacks were present in significant numbers, the threat of being lynched was always real. Blacks had to watch their step, no matter where they were in America. A black man could be walking down the road minding his business, and his life could suddenly change by meeting a white man or a group of white men or boys who on a whim decided to have fun with a Negro. And this could happen in Mississippi or New York, Arkansas, or Illinois. By the 1890s, lynching fever gripped the South, spreading like cholera, as white communities made blacks their primary target and torture their focus. Burning the black victim slowly for hours was the chief method of torture. Lynching became a white media spectacle in which prominent newspapers, like the Atlanta Constitution, announced to the public the place, date, and time of the expected hanging and burning of black victims. Often as many as 10 to 20,000 men, women, and children attended the event. It was a family affair, a ritual celebration of white supremacy, where women and children were often given the first opportunity to torture black victims, burning black flesh, cutting off genitals, fingers, toes, and ears as souvenirs. Postcards were made from the photographs taken of black victims with white lynchers and onlookers, smiling as they struck a pose for the camera. They were sold for 10 to 25 cents to members of the crowd, who then mailed them to relatives and friends, often with a note saying something like, "This is the barbecue we had last night." Cone goes on to say, the cross and the lynching tree interpret each other. Both were public spectacles, shameful events, instruments of punishment reserved for the most despised people in society. Unfortunately, during the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, this symbol of salvation has been detached from any reference of the ongoing suffering and oppression of human beings, those whom Ignacio Ellacuria, the Salvadorian martyr, called the crucified peoples of history. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with the re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. So, Chance and Bev, where do you see crucifixion in our world today? Where and how are crowds in our world being incited to chant for the killing of the innocent and being legally shielded to be able to do so?
Can we go back to January 6th?
Exactly. The thing that I thought of too.
Yeah, wasn't that a horrific scene, seeing those nooses hanging there at the Capitol, white supremacists wanting to go and find legislators to...
It's just...
Yep, they were bound. If they could have reached the vice president or any Congress members, they would have probably killed them, just because of the feelings in the crowd.
I also think that another example of that is unfortunately the injustice that people of color face on a day-to-day basis. And many times still to this day in 2021, the people that do these things are protected. All eyes right now are on Minnesota with the trial that's going on there. This is one person that's been, or I think the first person to go to trial in the George Floyd case, but this happens everywhere. And we only hear about the ones that we hear about. We don't know about the ones that have to, the families that suffer in silence because we don't know.
Yes, when you were reading about the lynching, I reminded me of the jogger last year in Georgia that was jogging down the street, and the white men grabbed him and killed him.
Yep. I don't know if you saw the news, but just a few days ago on Friday, so March 26th, 2021, exactly a week before Good Friday, there was a noose that was found hanging on the grounds of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. And it was a church that had hung a Black Lives Matter banner.
Yes.
This is still happening today.
And the other one that comes to mind is our killing of our prisoners, our trying to think, we either gas them and the idea is, I guess, to promote fear so that you won't do usually a murder. But the thing is, it doesn't work that way because most murders are impulsive acts and people aren't stopping to think, oh, if I do this, I'm going to be, I'll have the final days. And it's just, it's very cruel. And fortunately, I think the whole public is turning against it more and more because Virginia now has outlawed capital punishment. And we just hope that more and more states will agree to do that.
And how many people face that fate or are on death row and then come to find out after years something had DNA exonerates something happens and they were incarcerated for all this time and could have been killed.
Yeah.
And it not have been even something that they had done.
Right. Yeah. And I also think of the way we treat immigrants. I think about how many transgender individuals are murdered every year.
Yes.
We certainly seem to still have our form of crucifixion in our world today. Now, it seems to me that we have really weaponized this label, criminal, in our world too. Who do we label criminal or illegal? And why is it important for us to hear Jesus respond to this criminal with such love and such promise?
Well, like right away, I think of illegal immigrants. They're illegal. And most of them are mainly just people fleeing from a very bad situation, looking to start a new life. And I'm sure that Jesus would be opening his arms to them.
As if a person
Yes.
can be illegal. That's always, every time I hear that, no human being is illegal. Sometimes people do things that are illegal, but that doesn't mean that that person is illegal.
Well, and I think about the way we've hoisted criminal on Black bodies and people of color, the way people from Mexico have been talked about. And, and I believe in her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander talks about how it was actually a political campaign strategy to do that because it divided the Black and the white vote. And there's now been a senior Nixon official who has come out and said, yes, we did that. That was real. But we have, by labeling certain people criminal, felon, all those kinds of things, it's a way that we can then justify dehumanizing.
Because once you have that label, it does not go away. I mean, think about here in Florida, where a majority of Floridians voted for those who committed felonies to have the right to vote once they've served their time. Has that come to fruition? No. And you go to apply for a job, you have to check the box. And once you have that label, it is with you forever. And it's tragic. Nobody can dig themselves out of that.
Right. And I think about, the protests this summer and long before that, how many people were arrested and then ended up with a criminal record just for protesting injustice. I don't know how many clergy people I know who have an arrest record just for protesting injustice.
And last week, the lady in Georgia, the state representative that knocked on the governor's door, got a couple of felony charges.
Perfect example. Perfect example. Yeah. Black woman goes to knock on the door to watch this vote for voter suppression and gets arrested. And that's, gets the label criminal.
If she was white, they'd have opened the door. Sorry, but.
So why is it so important that Jesus responds to these two guys labeled criminal with such love and such promise? What do you think is so important about that?
Jesus is our example. So if he responds with love and he responds with grace, and I think it was Reverend Dr. Otis Moss that said in a seminar that I was in not too long ago, I think it was actually the cross and the lynching tree, he made a statement that I'll never forget. He said, Jesus was blessing while he was bleeding. And so if Jesus, our example, could do that from a cross, who am I to deny that to someone from the comfort that I live in every day?
And it says to me that God receives us no matter what we do. And that Jesus was just acting this out to illustrate this is how God would receive you.
Well, let's try to make sense of what happens when these three criminals, I mean, Jesus had that label put on him too, right? When they're crucified. Why do you think one joins in mocking him? What was that about?
I suspect he was a little bit jealous. They all had their names hanging up there, but Jesus was labeled the King of Jews. So I think it was a little bullying that he wanted Jesus to feel as helpless as he was. So he started taunting him.
Okay.
Bring him down to his level.
So maybe jealousy or maybe feeling helpless. Yeah. Yeah, almost that, like starting to go insane moment when you just feel so incredibly powerless and helpless. And let's see you try to stop them because I feel completely helpless to stop them. Yeah.
I think too that, I mean, one of the things about crucifixion, like I said earlier, was humiliation. And maybe he was trying to take some of the focus off of himself and make sure that people were more focused on Jesus than on him, because, you know, because he, I mean, in one article I read, it talks about how, I mean, he walked the same path that Jesus walked to the crucifixion. And maybe he just didn't want people looking at him. He wanted people to divert their attention somewhere else. And he thought if he joined in with the crowd, with the mocking, that would happen.
Or perhaps he'd watched the way the crowds had really rallied around Jesus. And maybe it was in part a warning to the crowds. Look, even he can't stop the iron grip of the empire from getting hold of him. Well, how about when the other criminal says that he and this other guy were being justly punished? What do you think he means by that? And is there a difference between what is just legally versus what is just morally?
Oh, I think there's definitely a difference between what's just legally and what's just morally. I mean, slavery was legal, but that was not morally just. And so many other things in our in our life that aren't. But I just wonder if this person is. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I just wonder if this individual maybe had been taught by Jesus. Maybe he was in some of the groups where Jesus had been teaching, or maybe he was taught by John the Baptist. And let's face it, if you were taught by John the Baptist, you repented. You knew about the kingdom if you were taught by John the Baptist. So I think maybe he recognized that he had done something wrong. He does say, we're here because we did these things, whatever those things were, and Jesus did not. So I think there might have been some kind of relationship or some interaction between this person and Jesus, maybe in the past before this happened. I don't know.
Well, I think you're hitting on something. I think it's very possible that morally, these two guys may have done nothing wrong. They may have been a part of the same movement as Jesus, really, standing up to the empire and the abuses and the exploitation and the oppression that was going on. But maybe they did so in ways that broke the law technically, and Jesus had done so in ways that technically didn't break the law. But I have a feeling that these were also oppressed, marginalized, occupied guys who had stood up to the empire. I mean, that's why you got crucified. So often we think of, okay, these are sinners hanging next to Jesus, and then Jesus says, and that very well may be the case, but I also think this may have been fellow people on the margins, fellow people who were oppressed. And how beautiful that Jesus makes this statement of solidarity, you'll be with me. James Cone says the gospel of Jesus is not a rational concept to be explained in a theory of salvation, but it's a story about God's presence in Jesus' solidarity with the oppressed, which led to his death on the cross. What is redemptive is the faith that God snatches victory out of defeat, life out of death, and hope out of despair. And I think it can be maybe both and. Chance, you brought up that this guy maybe seems to really realize they did something wrong. And maybe this is this real moment of grace. Bev, you mentioned that too, this moment when no matter what you've done, there's a seat for you at God's table. But there might also be this sense of anyone who is being killed by the empire for standing up, that God's going to take a stance of solidarity with you. Now, Luke goes to great lengths to show all throughout this part of the story that Jesus is innocent. His innocence, tumbles out of Pilate's mouth, and then it tumbles out of this criminal's mouth. And then after Jesus' death, his innocence will be confirmed and uttered by this Roman soldier who's watching what has happened. He exclaims, "Surely this was a righteous man." But I guess my question is, was Jesus innocent? What would you say?
Not in our eyes, perhaps, because he was working for the oppressed, but certainly the Romans could have construed it as trying to undo their occupation and to working against them. And in that way, he would have broken the law.
I would have, prior to doing research on this question, I probably would have said yes, he was innocent. But I read an article that talked about how Jesus was intentional with all of his actions from the very beginning. And if crucifixion, he would have been considered an enemy of the state by the things that he did. And he said from the beginning, these are the things that I'm going to do. And he did them.
And he knew that he was going to get capital punishment for them because he talked about his death was approaching. He knew, I think.
Yeah, over and over in almost all of the Gospels, Jesus is going to tell his disciples, the cross is coming, the cross is coming, the cross is coming. I'm headed toward the cross. He spent 3 years, and he may have very, closely walked that tight line so that he wasn't breaking laws. But he very much was kind of poking at the bear of the empire, right? I mean, he was poking and poking and poking. And
I'm sure they got worried because he was bringing out crowds of people.
Right.
And that would worry the Romans.
Right.
They could rebel, or it's almost like in Miramar now that the soldiers are killing people because they're standing up against the government. And and even in Hong Kong, there are people who are just standing up for their rights. They're not really rebelling. They just want their rights, and they're being killed or punished or imprisoned for that.
Right. It reminds me a lot of, Dr. King and the kind of nonviolent revolution he was trying to start. While he didn't violently riot or harm people, he was still poking at white supremacy.
And he was killed for it.
Right. And intentionally, knew what he was doing and ended up being killed for it.
Well, I think too, there's an important thing. I think Jesus was innocent, morally innocent, because he was fighting for the oppressed. And I think about, her name just escaped me as I started talking, but the family that housed and hid Anne Frank and her family were violating the law at the time, but they were morally right for doing what they were doing. And I think that Jesus was doing what was morally right, but the Romans, it broke Roman law.
Right.
So I think, again, it's a both and. He was innocent and he was not.
Well, what does the word paradise, which in Greek is paradiso, what does that mean?
It can be a heaven or an idyllic place or state of mind even. But it was interesting when I looked it up, they said the root actually came from a word that meant walled garden.
Right. Well, it's referencing the Garden of Eden, really. Kind of a pre-fall idyllic human community in which everyone is living kind of the way God originally intended, not, with all that human brokenness and all that.
I like that Beverly pointed out that it maybe even be a state of mind. I've been places that people say, "Oh, this is just paradise," and I'm thinking, I don't see that. But that's not my state of mind at that time.
Yeah, we talk a lot in Christian theological circles about kind of there being reality and then the kingdom of God kind of overlaying it, and people who, who follow Jesus kind of choosing to live more in the reality of the kingdom of God, even though they're surrounded by the reality of the world all the time. Yeah, and I like that, that Jesus says to this criminal, we're going to be in paradise together today. Well, as you hear this statement in our world today, what meaning does it take on for you, or what hope does it bring for you?
Well, obviously, the after-death experience is going to be positive.
And that no matter what, no matter how bad I think I've messed up, we live by grace and not perfection.
I've been participating in our Racist Anonymous group, and one of the things I think that has always hindered me from being a better ally is worrying about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, screwing up as an ally, basically. And I think about if this guy on the cross was a part of a very similar parallel movement to Jesus, opposing the empire, but he apparently went about it maybe the wrong way, Jesus still is offering him that grace. And that's beautiful. And I think that frees us up to, you try and you try again. And it's okay if you fall down.
I just felt that to that person, when he heard those words, how wonderful it must have felt to him that he wasn't alone and he had something to look forward to, and he was going there with Jesus.
Yeah, a lot of people had witnessed the power of the Jesus movement. It had really captivated a lot of people, and apparently this guy as well, who's being crucified alongside Jesus. And to hear Jesus just so confidently, I'm going to have the power to pull you into the kingdom of God.
Beautiful, beautiful last words.
There's a lot in that little bitty phrase. I mean, like so many of the phrases that Jesus said on the cross or from the cross. But that quote from Reverend Dr. Otis Moss is just, as soon as he said it, it stuck with me about Jesus blessing while he was bleeding.
Yes, thinking of others, right, when with his pain and suffering.
And some people in particular. I mean, we talked about that in the behold your son. And, he was, concerned about his mother and his friend, and all while he was being humiliated and tortured himself.
It's interesting you bring that up because is it Nowen who talks about being a wounded healer, that's what ministry,
Henry Nowen, yeah.
That's what ministry is about, is being the wounded healer. And I think whether we're a lay person in the church or ordained, following Jesus is about learning how to be that wounded healing presence in the world. Well, thank you both so much for having this conversation with me. Were you